Welcome to video number 4, Evolution through Natural Selection. So keep in mind that natural selection, we know that the environment determines which adaptations are most useful, and as a result, those particular organisms have some sort of adaptation or variation that allows them to survive, reproduce, and pass that on to their offspring. So keep in mind that the environment is going to determine which of these traits are most useful. So we're going to discuss 3 different types of natural selection. We're going to look at directional selection, then we're going to look at disruptive selection, and then something called stabilizing selection. So the first one is called directional selection. In directional selection, one phenotype is more favorable and the allele frequencies shift in one direction. So for example, one of the ideal scenarios that we can discuss is what happened with the peppered moths during the Industrial Revolution in Great Britain. So you may have heard this before, that the trees surrounding regions actually had these whitish lichens on them. And these are organisms that grow on the trees. And the moths that actually were whitish in color blended in very well with those trees and were able to evade predators. Now, as the Industrial Revolution took a head of steam, there was more and more pollution, and a lot of those lichens started to die off. And the tree colors started to get darker, which was more reflective of their bark color. So over a very short period of time, and keep in mind, this happens within a few populations, within a few generations, I should say, what will happen is that the moths that are darker in coloration will blend in better, and they're able to evade predators. And then over a few different generations, you start to see a greater frequency of the dark colored moth allele, because the environment determined that that actually was the best adaptation in order for them to survive. Now, keep in mind that the white allele stayed within the population, but it was recessive. So it was acted upon by natural selection. And what you'll look is, if you see the graph, here's the original population, and you can see that these were the whiter or the lighter color moths. Well, if you look, the curve or the graph shifts to the right directionally, favoring the darker colored moths. And that's the whole idea behind directional selection. And you should be able to look at these graphs and determine what's going on based upon the shift in the actual graph itself. Another good example of directional selection is antibiotic resistance. And we've discussed this many times before. However, some of the bacteria originally were not resistant to antibiotics. Antibiotics kill bacteria. So here is where there's a low drug resistance, right? But over time, what happens with antibiotics is the antibiotics will kill the majority of the bacteria. But the ones that survive are the ones that have the resistant trait. And as a result, you'll see this curve shift. Here's our original population where these were non-resistant. And then over time, what's going to happen is they are more and more resistant. Now, the question is, where did the resistant trait come from? Most likely a mutation. The selective pressure that determined the shifting of this particular graph to the right was the use of antibiotics. The ones that had the resistive trait, they were selected for, they survived, they reproduced, and over time, we see this directional shift towards more and more bacteria that are actually antibiotic resistant. But once again, you could see the pattern in the actual graph itself. Another good example is through the evolution of horses. And body size of horses and this happened over a very long period of time. Keep in mind, antibiotic resistance can happen over a short period of time. This is an example of natural selection over a long period of time, or directional selection. And if we look, the initial distribution of Hyracotherium was a smaller body size. They were selected for, maybe because they were able to get to food sources. Whatever reason, that smaller body size had some sort of selective advantage. But over time, we see the shift to a larger body size, more likely because the larger bodied equus was able to evade predators, was able to find food, was able to somehow fend for itself. Maybe the larger horses at the time, or equus, were selected for because they were reproductively, they had some sort of reproductive advantage. Maybe the mates were looking for larger offspring. But the whole idea is that the environment shifted the body size, and we're talking about over millions of years, or thousands of years, I should say. Okay, so that's directional selection. The next type of selection that we're going to talk about is something called disruptive selection. And if you look, this is the original population somehow gathered around the mean. And in disruptive selection, we have selection against the mean. In other words, the extremes of each trait is favored now. So this is one extreme, or one phenotype that's at the extreme, and here's another phenotype that's at the extreme. Here's the original population. So somehow the original population trait did not have the selective advantage, but the two extremes did. So let's take a look at an example of this. One of these are the Himalayan rabbits. The original population of a Himalayan rabbit, the majority of them, the population was a white rabbit. But over time, there was changes in the environment, more specifically in some of the vegetation that was present, in some of the rocky terrain. And again, this is over a long period of time. What happens is you start to see that the white ones are selected against, and now we're selecting for the darker versions, the real dark ones and the ones that are slightly gray. So we're selecting against the mean. And when you look at disruptive selection, you're going to look for this pattern. You're going to see that the actual mean itself is selected away from. Another example of disruptive selection is with respect to coho salmon. Now, the medium-sized the medium-sized coho salmon originally were very successful at competing for territory. But over time, the larger salmon had a selective advantage, more likely than not due to their size, the ability to get food, and the ability to evade some predators, right? So the larger ones were selected for. The smaller ones were selected for, and research shows that the smaller ones were able to sneak in and fertilize their eggs without being actually detected. So again, here's a disruptive selection. The medium-sized coho salmon is selected against, the small ones and the larger ones are selected for. So the extremes of the phenotype are actually selected for. And this is the last one. This is called stabilizing selection. It's kind of the opposite of disruptive, where the extremes in each population, or the extreme phenotype, is selected against. And we start to see the population moves towards a middle ground. So it's kind of the opposite of disruptive selection. And there's a couple of really good examples of stabilizing selection. So for example, robins usually will lay 4 eggs. Now, if they lay more than 4 eggs, keep in mind that when all of those eggs hatch, well, the robins have to somehow nurture, provide food, provide protection for a much larger brood. And that actually is selected against, because it takes a tremendous amount of effort and energy to care for that many offspring. So what happens is oftentimes many of those offspring die. On the other end of the spectrum, what may happen is that when they lay fewer eggs, not all the eggs hatch into healthy robins. So what happens is many times these will die as well. So now the smaller hatchlings and the larger sized hatchlings, or the larger number of eggs or larger number of offspring, are selected against. And you start to see a more of a median number of eggs that actually get hatched. So in stabilizing, the selection is against the two extremes. One more example. If you look, there's something called the Canadian gallfly. Now, the Canadian gallfly is actually predated by wasps and woodpeckers. Now, the woodpeckers are very successful at predating on the larger gallflies. The wasps are much better at predating on the smaller ones. So which ones survive? Well, the ones that are kind of medium in size. So we're selecting against the small and we're selecting against the large. And this would be an example of stabilizing selection. There's another example of stabilizing selection, which isn't so apparent now because of medical technology, but one of them used to be human birth weight. So before we had all the medical technology, low birth weight babies had a much smaller opportunity to survive. We didn't have the advanced neonatal intensive units that we have now. And larger ones, much larger babies, oftentimes would die during childbirth. So you started to see at that particular time that birth weight was kind of pushed towards some sort of a medium size, away from very, very small infants and away from very, very large infants. Now, keep in mind, that does not necessarily hold true anymore because of all the medical technology that we had. So these are the three types of natural selection that can occur. Keep in mind, we had directional, we had disruptive, and we had stabilizing. It's the environment that determines which of these traits are selected for, and keep in mind, true with all evolution, some evolution happens within a very short period of time, and sometimes evolutionary change happens within a very long period of time. And the two sources for variation are always sexual reproduction and possible mutations.